Hi everybody, welcome to the Pervasive Media Studio lunchtime talk today. So these talks are live every Friday at 1 p.m, both here in the building and live online. So whether you're in Bristol or far away, you can join in the conversation. So my name's Vic Tillotson, I'm the talent development lead at Watershed. I'm a white woman wearing a green jumper, blue trousers, and I have short brown hair. So every Friday, we open the doors of the studio for Open Studio Friday, where we offer you the chance to spend time in the space, hot desking alongside our residents and staff between 10 and 5. An especially big welcome today to those of you who are new to the studio, or for whom this may be the first time you're kind of coming along and engaging with us. Is there anybody here that's here for the first time? Yes. Yeah. Oh, welcome. It's lovely to see you. So what is Pervasive Media Studio? So we're a diverse and collaborative community exploring creativity and technology with everything from comedy to coding and product development to performance art. It's a partnership between Watershed, the University of the West of England, and the University of Bristol. We offer studio space, desk space, meeting rooms, events and opportunities to our residents, as well as a spirit of generosity and mutual exchange. We're a space for people to take risks with early ideas and to make time for collaboration. So a quick bit of housekeeping before we kick off with the talk. So feel free to move around, make a cup of tea or grab a glass of water from the kitchen. And we've got a quiet space just next door to the left if anybody needs to take a break at any point. Fire exits are at either end of the studio, just over that way. One of the studio team will direct you to them should we need to use them. Accessible toilets and baby change can be found in the corridor just over there next to the kitchen. There's a Q&A at the end of the talk. For those of you watching online, please pop your questions in the YouTube chat. We've got Tony in the room here who will be voicing those for us today. And if you're in the building, you can raise your hand. We've got a microphone that we'll bring to you. The microphone, it doesn't amplify your voice in the space, but it enables the people online to hear the question that you're saying. So if you can sort of hold that up to your mouth as you speak, but it does feel a bit strange, but it is working. So you can get news on all our future talks by heading to watershed.co.uk/studio, and we're also on Twitter and Instagram too. So now I'd like to introduce our speaker for today. This is Graham MacLeod Johnson, who's going to talk to us about poor wellbeing in the arts and culture sector and what we can do about it. So over to you, Graham.
Hello, lovely, cheerful, thank you, cheerful topic. As you could probably guess, I did sort of work out my whole talk and then remember actually talking about this stuff has a lot of potentially sensitive or triggering stuff in. So just at the top, stuff that would potentially have you using that quiet space. Sort of because of this is about well-being, we talk about physical health, mental health, emotional health. There's talk about loss of income, unstable work and contracts in the sector. There's talk about something else off the top of my head, and I'm doing these without having written these bits down. That was very productive. Capitalism, oppression, privilege, all of the good stuff. Just sort of context on me first. Graham MacLeod Johnson. I'm, in terms of PM Studio, I'm quite a recent resident, but I've been in and around for quite a while. I have worked with studio residents Kid Carpet and Trigger. And before that, I was on the creative producing masters delivered in partnership with the University of the West of England, which is where I first started digging into burnout in the sector all across the country and why it happens to so many people in the sector so often. I'm also an illustrator, which I mostly use to do really silly presentations to try and soften the fact that I'm talking about serious stuff all the time. And I'm a wellbeing consultant for organizations and individuals in the sector under the name Radical Wellbeing. Sometimes when I tell people that, they kind of assume that I've really got it together when it comes to my own well-being. So I should reassure you that I actually burn out semi-regularly, and that's going to become relevant later. Before we get any further, I didn't do a self-description, so I am a white person with a yellow mohawk flopped over to one side, dark hair and a beard. I'm wearing a pink and white jacket, brown trousers, and a black t-shirt with a wolf on. I'm queer, I'm disabled in that I've got multiple neurodivergent diagnoses and long-term mental health conditions. I use he and they pronouns, and it's really nice when both are used because people tend to just stick to he. Between the voice and the fact that I mentioned doing a master's, you've probably guessed that I'm from a deeply middle-class background. Pointed out that I'm white, and even though when I think too long about my gender, I tend to need to go and lie down in a dark space, it seems relevant to acknowledge that people typically see me as male, and that has had a lot of advantages for me in terms of getting here. I do this because I think it is important to acknowledge privilege and oppression when we're talking about well-being. We can't talk about how we can be okay without discussing those issues. And so this is just my lived experience and where this talk is coming from today. That's a lot of time talking about me, it feels like, whereas we're here to talk about the idea that well-being can be radical, particularly in this sector. So we should look at the well-being landscape in arts and culture. I feel like giving an image description for the slide kind of gives a good summary of where things are at. Everyone is running about, crying in massive distress, while the entire sector burns around them in a horrendous trash heap. But also, this one guy is kind of doing pretty okay. If you wanted nuance, you came to the wrong talk. I don't really do a lot of that, subtlety not my thing. When I first started looking at well-being in the sector, COVID wasn't even on the radar. It was years before that, but things don't look too different there. It's probably as much burning trash, but it's slightly different burning trash. The biggest issue at the time was precarity, the way that we have a sector built on unstable funding, unstable income, and so everyone's job is unstable, poorly paid, and even if you're in a salaried position, that might not be the case for a very long time because your job is often based on the last batch of funding for the latest project. It's something that is a side effect of post-Fordism, which is where we are currently at within capitalism. It's the idea that we moved away from the production line towards specialist production, and it's kind of the basis for going back to New Labour's creative economy. Artists and creatives were taught under Thatcher that they didn't really need state welfare to look after themselves because it wasn't there. And so suddenly culture was an incredibly cheap export that brought in a lot of money. Why support artists when it's just profitable not to? As such, we're here now, no real financial support for our industry, or at least no consistent financial support. I did say that it's a cheerful talk. This leads to a lot of issues, and it's not unique to our sector, of course. Academia, Uber drivers, it's all precarity, it's all dangerous, and it's all getting worse. Mark Fisher notes in Capitalist Realism that his students commonly exhibited depressive hedonia, going into increasingly bohemian expressions to ensure that they felt anything and could escape the danger of that situation. So when you have that image of the bohemian artist just drinking, doing drugs, and being very cool, it's not cool. It's kind of a lot worse than it looks because it's the only way of surviving what is happening around them. It does lead to the practice where so many of us, because of all these unstable, short, potentially part-time jobs, we might have 5 of them at once because we need the safety net. And it almost, you speak to people and it becomes an addiction. The adrenaline and buzz of that danger of always being on the go, it starts to feel exciting. And so all of that danger sits underneath a constant flow of adrenaline. Beyond that, you've got the fact that our sector is built on networking and sometimes, if we wanted to use another word, nepotism. If we're all out there trying to seem professional, respectable, good at what we do, often healthy and happy, because if that's not happening, if that's not who we are presenting in person and online, we're not getting the work. We're not getting our stable income. We're not surviving. We don't really train artists to be good business people. We don't train people to bring in income and support themselves. And beyond that, a lot of artists tend to make emotional work. When I was doing research, one survey respondent talked about how she was cast in a theatre production about a mother losing a child when she'd just gone through a similar experience herself, and there was no understudy and no one to talk to about it, and it went exactly as you might imagine that situation going. And yet, people seem to love it. People are driven towards it, and we call it passionate work. We use the language of passion and love and really positive language because it's the arts, it's culture. We get drawn towards this love for an image that is different to the person sat at a desk behind a spreadsheet, which in reality is a lot of staying in business in the arts. But it's fine because it's still the arts. Sometimes when you look at passion and you wanted to use different language, you could talk about obsession. You could talk about an all-encompassing obsession that drags you along and keeps you going despite the fact that it is damaging your health. It's something that has been looked at by many researchers. Arvidsson, Malozzi, and Narrow looked at it within the Milan fashion industry. Angela McRobbie talks about precarity and passionate work at length in Be Creative, brilliant book, very depressing. And yeah, it leads to a burning trash fire. We sometimes look at it and look at other sectors and say, oh, it's not that bad. If you look at the games industry, there are class action lawsuits being filed against companies all the time because of crunch working, the practice of working sort of 80-hour, 120-hour weeks for no overtime pay, just because you want to work in the games industry, just because it's the culture. And then people look at that and go like, the arts isn't like that, and then go to their own 80-hour week, which they're not paying themselves properly for, and pretend that it's not happening. COVID obviously made a lot of this worse. People's income disappeared, and then they had to fight over the emergency funding that was doled out, justifying why they're more deserving of it than all of the other people that they cared about. It was obviously awful for those who didn't get it, and those who did get it, many of them had a form of survivor's guilt when they looked at those around them, just wondering what they would do. Add to that all of the things that everyone went through with COVID. But weirdly, it did improve some aspects of well-being. Organizations started to wake up to the idea that people might need looked after a little bit, just slightly, maybe. Some of those things have stuck around and some of those haven't. You might remember this slide earlier and how it pointed out that I'm disabled and how that person is me. When I talk about COVID having made well-being better, some people pull a very strange face when they look at me. But when you look at it through a disabled lens, that statement gets a lot clearer. If you do some research, you can find plenty of people talking about the ways that COVID leveled the playing field. The social model of disability is the model that takes the disabling factor of disability not as the conditions that people have, but the barriers that society places upon them. And COVID meant that all of society was facing barriers put upon them. For the first time, the world had to become accessible because people who weren't disabled needed that as well. Zoom and online meetings became regular practice for everyone. Flexible working became a lot more common, and generally it was just understood that people might not be okay and might need a bit of understanding and care around work and their working practices. This was also the time when I started using an access statement myself. My access statement isn't long, complicated. It's actually quite cute, depending on how you look at it. It's a really good access statement or a really bad one. When the world did start shifting back to normal at what felt like breakneck speed, I did notice something though. In terms of an image description for this slide, there's me just at the front looking very sweet with a sign saying, "I've got needs, please don't hate me," while someone stands in the background with a very shabby bag of their own needs. And that's because while I still found it quite easy to have conversations about my individual needs, as we started coming out of lockdown, as we started coming out of people believing that the pandemic needed to be talked about, I started seeing the people around me struggle. One organization I worked at the time took my request for flexible working as an access adjustment and allowed me to move my hours around and work from home when I had an online therapy appointment. And yet my colleague, who would legally meet the definition of disability but didn't use the language and didn't use the language of access, was denied the same adjustments. People's needs are obviously complex, and talking about access needs versus care needs can be complex because not meeting access needs can prevent someone from working at all, whereas a care need, you're just going to make their life a lot more uncomfortable for working. And yet, when you take away the fear of accusations of discrimination, when you take away the fear of a damaged reputation for an organization or collaborator, the desire to meet someone's individual needs, the desire to find out about them, starts to fall away, starts to fade. I could talk for a long time about the many reasons why that's the case. It would be a whole talk in itself, but one of the big reasons is just resource, time and money. We're in a sector which doesn't have a lot of either, and so it starts to make sense that that's the case until you remember the job you were in where you were so stressed and hated everything so much that you came in, stared at your screen for the whole day, and then left. It suddenly starts to feel a lot more wasteful to pay an employee not to work for a week than it does to spend some time identifying their needs and exploring how to meet them. You might not be able to meet every need, but you're never going to meet any of them if you don't try to find out what they are. because it is too expensive, because it does take up too much resource, people are directed to self-care. We get told to tool up with yoga, with scented candles and bars, with exercise and breathing exercises and mental exercises to look after ourselves. If you need an image description for the slide, I've drawn a D&D party, tooled up with all of these things, sailing away in a bath. If the arts are inherently damaging to well-being, then it's seen as the responsibility of individuals to look after themselves through that, because they chose to be a part of that. They have to face the consequences. Give them the tools, give them the quest, and send them on their way. It's no longer the organization's or collaborators' responsibility. But the problem is, I've not yet found a breathing exercise that makes it easier to choose losing a paid day of my freelance contract over having a panic attack in the workplace. I've not gone to an ethical market and found a scented candle that smells like the thoughtful deconstruction of capitalism's most harmful structures. I can't couch to 5K away from nepotism. And if one of you does find the bath bomb that fizzes away the systemic oppression of everyone who isn't dripping privilege from every pore, I'd probably like to make a bulk order, so let me know where it is. I genuinely believe that nobody in this sector or elsewhere is setting out to hurt others. But that doesn't mean that they aren't doing that. I've known plenty of people in positions of authority who have felt trapped into harmful working processes by making a budget balance. I've known people in large organizations who feel they can't even start to make change because of the red tape, because bureaucracy stops movement, it stops change. I've seen projects grow and grow and grow because people are really excited by them, and yet the money doesn't change, the deadline doesn't change because the venue is booked, because they've started selling the tickets. Going back to the games industry, they call that feature creep, but we just call it normal practice. I've seen incredible emerging practitioners get passed up because they didn't have the network connections to get them the job. And I've seen plenty of people hired because an organization wanted to appear more diverse, and then very quickly realized that the organization doesn't understand the realities of working with someone from that background. In a sector that's up against all of that, where looking after people's well-being is inherently a radical act. It's doing something different. It is doing something that can be revolutionary, because it means saying no to all of that. It means saying that you're going to do something different. It means that recognizing that the system isn't working for one person means the system isn't working, and it should be changed. It means taking the gift of the burning trash heap that we saw earlier and seeing that it's a chance to build something new and something different, even if it takes a few goes to get it right. There's an idea that we can't start this change until we know what the end result looks like. Whereas what we could be doing is imagining an end result and taking the first step to get there, and then realizing the end result needs to be different and continuing to work iteratively. In bits. That change is going to take a long time. There's a lot of reasons why we're here. The way that our work is funded, the policies that are being made, but also the policies that date back decades. They lock us into a place where we can't move forward very easily. So until that point, there are things that we need to do to look after ourselves and each other. We do need to think about self-care, which I may have just been very harsh on earlier, but it's self-care in a sense that is more thoughtful. It is based in the idea that we see the situation around us, we recognize that it's broken, that it isn't looking after us, and look at the ways in which we can stand up for ourselves. We need to support each other, whether we're an individual or an organization that has care specifically for the people under it. We need to be caring and responsible and understanding. We can be transparent about the fact that this isn't good. There's an idea that if we are talking about the issues, then we're making them more real. But people are experiencing the issues anyway. It doesn't damage reputation to talk about the issue that is happening, because if you don't talk about that, people will probably read between the lines and find something much worse. So why not talk to people about the real problems? Why not be vulnerable? When you give people vulnerability, you earn trust. When you let down your shield, or if you are an animal and reveal your soft underbelly, you are giving trust and you are hoping to earn trust. So why do we see authority and vulnerability as separate things? And one thing that I feel like I don't hear people talk about in the same way as those two is the power of permission. There's often an assumption that people know it's okay not to be okay. They know it's okay to speak up, to ask, to state their needs. But in a sector where you might lose your job because you have made the wrong impression on someone, it's dangerous to speak up. It's dangerous to admit that you're not okay. And so giving permission is important. Giving permission and safety for that is something different in itself. The methods that we've been using to look after people, the methods of care out there, don't take into account capitalism. They don't take into account the fact that these problems don't sit within the individual. We can't give someone a prescription for antidepressants and hope that they will be okay, because the world around us is the problem. Yes, maybe their brain chemistry, that does happen a lot. That is also there. But people's health, emotionally, mentally, physically, is impacted by the world around them, whether it is the people immediately around them, whether it is the organizations they work for, whether it is the government that we are under, whether it is our slowly decreasing resources and climate. That's another talk. All of that has an impact. And so we need to stop asking people to look after themselves entirely and start talking about the bigger problems. When I say radical well-being, it's not some self-aggrandizing statement that, yeah, when you work with me, you're going to do incredible things. It is simply saying the fact that I believe that it is inherently radical to talk about well-being as something that can be changed and something that can be improved. So it's an invitation to look around, see the problems, talk about them, and try something different. I've got a feeling this might technically be slightly early, but that's me. It's question time.
Thank you so much, Graham. It's amazing. Does anybody have any questions they'd like to ask? Just pass this to you.
Yeah. I've worked in the film industry since I was 16. Grew up around it. So I was working class, and I've worked my way up to be middle class. So I don't really share in the privilege guilt construct. So I'm not quite sure how I'm meant to feel about that, having lived it as a life, because I've got many back injuries, insomnia, drug problems, everything you could associate with working in the film industry has gone wrong at some point. But I've made a success out of it. So I don't know how I'm meant to feel about myself anymore.
I mean, for what it's worth, I would start with the fact that I don't think it's useful to think of privilege in terms of guilt. I think it's mostly useful to think of privilege in terms of how you can use it, but also you make a very important point that that's not privilege you have. You've got everything that comes with your background taking you there, and you've done all of the work to get to where you are now, and all of the injuries, physical or emotional, from working in your industry. It sounds like you don't have a lot to worry about in terms of how you look at yourself. You sound like you've got quite a good angle in it. But I guess my main takeaway from what you said was that idea of privilege being something that we need to be guilty about, whereas when you're feeling guilty, you're not doing something useful. You're stopping yourself doing something useful.
Okay. Yes. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.
Hi, thank you so much for being super honest, because it's a really big, difficult thing to talk about. I am in a very privileged position at the moment where I get to come up with a concept for a new fashion system. And one of the things that I'm starting to look at is in the indigenous approach, so utilising things around you. So I just wondered if you would talk to me a little bit about whether you think there are any barriers to using an indigenous approach when we think about people's well-being, or whether that's a really good idea.
Graham, I'm sorry to put in. Asking my man if you can restate the question before you answer it. My apologies, I broke you off then.
Oh, restate the question. Good. So the question was around if there's any barriers or concerns around using an indigenous approach to fashion and making
creative
fashion.
cultures, when you're thinking about creating something and designing something from scratch, if we think about people and place as the design space, how do we work that into well-being?
I guess so that I can answer this usefully, to what extent are you looking at using that? How are you involving the people in those places?
So, yes.
Could you hold the mic a bit
More,
nearer?
sorry. So we're at the very start of the process. So the short answer is I don't know. And that's what I was partly here today to find out as well, is I'm trying to collect people's thoughts on what good practice is and how we can put people at the heart of design in order to create a sustainable design system.
You do sound like you're in a incredible position for doing that, because it sounds like, in theory, you've got a blank slate. You've got nothing to base this on. And so, in some ways, it feels like in asking the question, you have answered a lot of it, in that you have stated that you want to design this around people. You want to design this around how to care for and respect those people. And I feel sort of slightly odd saying this, because my brain is telling me it sounds patronizing, but start by asking them. Find the people that you want to work with and ask them what respect and care looks like to them. And then when you are designing your process, when you're designing how you are going to work with these people, try and work around that. If there are things that they ask for that you can't provide, go back and have that conversation. Don't say that you will meet that need or meet that request and just slowly distance yourself from that. Admit that it's not an option. Admit that you can't do the exact thing that they've asked for, but you want to talk about something that would be okay. Is that useful?
Yeah, that's lovely. It is. Can I have a follow-up question? Is that allowed?
Yes, yeah, go on.
Sorry. How much do we need to respect everyone as an individual within a new space, or do we take the approach? I don't know how to frame this. When we build HR policies now, we do it in a generalized thing,
Yeah.
and then we try and help where we can, but it's a one glove doesn't fit anyone model. So how much effort do we need to put into recognizing every single individual within, say we grow to 50 people? How do you function as a business and do that? Do you know the answer? And you can say no as well, that's fine.
You've already pointed out that one glove doesn't fit anyone, so I can't give a blanket answer in that the specific ways in which your business works, the specific needs of your business alongside the people within it will affect what that looks like. But I would say that it starts with intention and openness. There's that point of vulnerability in that if you can start a working culture from the start where people can speak up about these needs, you're not constantly checking in on everyone. You're not constantly going to people and asking because you've given a space where it is safe for them to come to you. In the broader sense, I would start from a place of inquiry and move to that space of listening.
Thank you, that's awesome.
Thank you.
Any other questions? Tony? Pass this to you.
First of all, Graham, people are saying some really lovely things online. If you need a pick-me-up, go and read through your messages, I reckon. But I will go with BDJ Crumps says, thank you, Graham, such an eloquent articulation of these issues. Given what you've covered, what would you say to somebody thinking about embarking on a career in the arts?
That is yeah, when I give a talk like this, it does sound like I should be standing here telling you not to. I think that that is unfair, but I think that my advice is simply to spend a lot of time with yourself and spend a lot of time working out what you need and how you're going to ask for what you need. You're not going to get away from the systemic issues that I talked about. It's impossible. And so going in with an awareness of the context, with an awareness that you will face challenges that realistically, at some point, your health will be impacted and you probably can't escape that, is depressing but essential, and kindness to yourself around the fact that, I should look at the webcam, hi. Kindness to yourself around the fact that you won't know some of your needs until they've been violated. You won't know that you need something until someone very abruptly takes that need away from you. And so accepting that when you start working in the arts, you won't have all of the answers to your care. You can be kind to yourself when it goes wrong. Be kind to yourself when it's hard.
Thanks, Graham. There's actually another question in here which bleeds on from what you just said there. Melissa Blackburn asks, how can we support these issues without overburdening the people who are experiencing them and therefore know most about them?
That is a good question that I feel like is always on people's minds and isn't getting asked anyway. One thing when I do work with an organization in this capacity is I do try and start the conversations around hierarchies and, well, it's hard to get away from the fact that hierarchies have a use as well as having a lot of problems, but they make it very easy for people further down a hierarchy not to empathize with people higher up the hierarchy, not to see how much they are carrying, and not to see that the damages of process and policy are not the choice necessarily of the people who are actioning them. And so when I do talk about vulnerability, when I do talk about transparency, I'm also talking about the fact that when you're in a position to be caring and responsible for others, then you need to be open about how hard that is sometimes. Without taking over someone's narrative when they come to you for care, you need to find space to let them know that you are carrying a lot, you are struggling. And finally, I would say it goes back to what I said before around admitting when you can't meet the needs, admitting when it just isn't possible to do this as people are asking for. And so going back and seeing what some form of compromise might look like.
Is there any more questions? Great, so go here first and then there.
First of all, thanks, Graham. That was fantastic. So it seems like you're sort of presenting this kind of well-being journey from the not caring at all through this sort of very neoliberal bureaucratic understanding of well-being through to sort of a mixed situation like we have in the arts now, through to a more radical understanding, through to the full overthrow of capitalism. And it's like, do you think that full journey is necessary, or is it possible to shortcut it, or are there other routes that would get us there faster or better?
It's a good question. Are there routes that shortcut, not necessarily the full overthrow of capitalism, but certainly a place that is more functional where we are now? The short answer is I don't know. The longer answer is if we start having these conversations, we could find out. If we start having these conversations, we could stumble across something. It's about not waiting for the fully formed system. If we spend all the time for our health waiting for the complete collapse of society so that we can make a better one, we're going to be waiting maybe not that long. But it will be a lot quicker if we start with one small act and go from there rather than waiting for the large act. It feels like a bit of a hand-wavy answer, if I'm honest, but like I said, I don't know.
Thanks.
Thank you so much. I have so many questions that actually I think I'd like to hire you, so that's good. But this one, I guess as an artist and creative worker, I feel like over the years I've actually been very well met by the organisations that I've worked with. And I have epilepsy, and so actually quite regularly I have to cancel stuff at the last minute. I have automatic text messages I send. And a lot of the narrative around how to deal with that instructs me as this artist to be kind of needy and victimized and defiant. And I actually feel very grateful and very guilty. And I feel really awful when I can't meet deadlines, and especially when I can see that my team are suffering. And this sort of position of needy, defiant victimhood doesn't feel very new paradigm at all. And I wonder if you have some advice that for me and other people like me, where we are actually really well supported, but we still kind of, because of society making us feel bad, we should be oh, thank you, I'm so sorry that I'm so rubbish. Instead, how else can I respond and have empathy for my team that suffers from my suffering?
Sorry. That is a really important question that I'm going to slightly vamp over me thinking for an answer for by saying this. The narrative that you should be needy, that you should be taking a stand and, well, frankly, being angry is really powerful. It's out there everywhere, and I feel like no one consulted the disabled community on it before giving it to us. There's a lot there, and on some level, the most useful answer that I can give is work with a really good therapist, because a lot of what you are describing, a lot of the guilt around that care, around receiving and on some level needing, does come from a place of trauma. That society is inherently ableist, and we learn to be ableist ourselves and apply that to ourselves. I experience it frequently. I am not good to myself in terms of my disabilities sometimes, and it is challenging because we are simultaneously told that we are the problem, but also that we're not, and we need to stop saying that we are, but also that we are the problem. The best that I can say without being a therapist is starting from that place of exploring that trauma within yourself and exploring where that sense of guilt comes from. But in terms of working with your team, I would go back to the two words that I keep saying of transparency and vulnerability. It's okay, without using them as a therapist, without using them as a space to process the trauma, you can hold that while still saying, actually, this is hard. I don't feel good that this happened. I know that you are fine with it, but I want to take a moment to say, this doesn't feel good for me. Because at the end of the day, I can say find a good therapist, but that costs a lot of money. So isn't always an option. I hope that you start to find some kindness to yourself in that over time.
Thanks. Is there any other questions? I had a question, actually.
Cool.
You mentioned in the talk about your access statement, and I think you said it was quite cute, or good or bad. I just wondered if you could talk a little bit about that statement, what it is, how you use it, that kind of thing.
Yeah, absolutely. So it's out there in a couple of different forms, but my access statement is public. It's in all my email signatures, and it is illustrated in much the same way as this talk, because when I designed it, I was like, oh, people will pay more attention to this if it's really approachable and simple and easy to understand. It doesn't ask for a lot. A lot of it is essentially being nice to me. I'm not going to lie, it comes down to that. And when people read it, they say, oh, but isn't that just what a workplace should be? Isn't that how people should interact with you at work generally? And that is because an accessible workplace is better for everyone. There's a lot out there that shows that. And I get people coming to me all the time saying, this is really useful, I understand your needs really well. I get disabled people looking at it and going, I didn't realize it was so simple to state my needs. I'm going to go away and do that now. And yet, on an incredibly regular basis, a lot of the people who have come to me, collaborators, employers, so on, saying, thank you so much for stating your needs. Thank you for telling me what accessibility means to you. Almost immediately forget those adjustments. It is not common that people remember quite simple points that I've made. For example, I request that if people want to book in a meeting with me, they actually say what it's for, so I don't think that I'm going to get fired the next day. Almost never happens. And I would say that by making it so approachable, by making it so kind and caring to its audience, I've made it easier for people to ignore it. I've made it easier for people to tell themselves, I read the access statement, I've done the right thing, I'm a wonderful person, and then stop. And so I sometimes ask myself if I need to make it harsher, if it needs to be a bit scarier, a bit harder for people to read, but then would people read it? And I do think of the fact that when disabled people tell me that it's inspired them to create their own, that is important to me. But I worry about contributing to a culture where people self-congratulate over not looking after disabled people. So when I say that it is a great access statement and an awful one, that's what I mean.
that makes sense. Is there any final questions from the room? Yeah, one at the back, Holly. I'll just, if you can hold this up to your mouth so people online can hear you.
Yeah.
Thanks.
Yeah, it's not a question, but just an observation. It's really brilliant to hear your presentation today. And I was also thinking about access statements, and I've just recently, not that long ago, written an access rider for myself, and I found it super helpful to do a bit of research about what's already out there and different styles of like access statements and riders, and then try and think, okay, what's going to work best for me, and then like just do that thing of being quite brave and going, I'm going to be super clear in it and send it out and see what comes back, and choosing who I chose to send it to first. Like I did have that option to do that, so that it felt a little safer. And in some of them I've actually asked for a clause to go in the contract, part of which says that the company agree that they've read the access statement, that we'll agree what can be met, and that there'll be a key person to have contact with around how those access needs are met. But I'm also aware that that was quite a scary process as well. So I'm not sure whether there is like one kind of clear answer, but it's certainly helpful to, I'm finding it helpful to be going through that process and kind of pleasantly surprised at some stuff that's come back. But yeah, also mindful about when I choose to use that as well. And I kind of feel like knowing about access to work and how that works, the government scheme has been really helpful in terms of kind of getting some support in place.
Wonderful.
That
Thank you.
was really useful to hear, and I need to start doing that point around bringing it into the contracting process myself, because I don't. So when I say that I'm not good at looking after myself as a disabled person, that's one of those.
It's hard. It's really hard. It's like, it takes quite a lot. Yeah, like judging when it feels safe to do it. That's how I feel. But often as well.
It takes a lot of emotional labor from people who don't have the energy to do the emotional labor of that. So that's really useful and helpful. Thank you. But
Brilliant. Well, we'll wrap up with one final question from me, which is, what are you going to do with radical wellbeing next? How are you getting it out there?
thank you. That is a useful question that I should probably say something about. So radical wellbeing is something that kind of, I would say it's hard to talk about because it looks like whatever the people that get me to work in that way need, but on the other hand, I have just made an info pack and put it on my website, and there's information about it on my website. Please look at it. Please work with me. I hear nice to work with and very flexible. But that is the short version of that. It's arguably early days. Arguably, I've been doing this for years and not calling it radical wellbeing and not calling it wellbeing work. Please look at my website, grahamacleodjohnson.com. On social media, I'm Mr. G Johnson on Twitter, that's MR. On Instagram, that's Mr. the full word. Very useful, I know. Thank you.
Fantastic. Thank you, Graham. So quickly before everybody disappears, if you want to stick around on Hot Desk today or find out more about what we do, then please come and find one of the studio team. Can you put your hands up, please? Thank you. Yeah, come and find one of us and we'll be happy to chat with you and help you out. If you're watching online, do drop us a line on studio@watershed.co.uk with any questions that you might have following the talk. Thanks for being here today. We'll see you all same time, same place next week. Thank you.